Beyond the Gate spoilers tease that Jacob's suspicions begin with a conversation he was never meant to hear. In the dim corridor of the precinct, where the flickering light cast more shadows than clarity, Jacob paused outside the office door of Marcel. He hadn't intended to listen, but Joey's voice, sharp and anxious, carried through the wood. Words about moving the funds and covering the trail spilled into the hallway. Jacob froze, his pulse tightening in his throat. He had long suspected Marcel of holding back secrets, of cloaking something in that calculated calm of his. The tension between them wasn't new, it had been simmering for years, a quiet animosity beneath every shared glance, every clipped exchange. Marcel had always been the superior officer with an air of authority, but Jacob, newly reassigned to investigative duty, was no longer the rookie confined to paperwork. He was stepping into spaces Marcel once controlled alone, and the balance was shifting. The weight of this overheard exchange pressed on Jacob's mind as he moved through the next days. He catalogued every gesture Marcel made, every stray look, every file moved across his desk. Jacob had always been wary, but now his instincts screamed at him that Marcel was entwined in something bigger, something darker. What Jacob didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that this thread ran deeper than his suspicions allowed. There was an organization, one so deeply entrenched in secrecy that even its whispers felt forbidden. His father, Elon, moved like a ghost, invisible yet decisive, shaping events Jacob couldn't yet understand. It was this blind spot, this absence of knowledge about Elon's allegiance, that made Jacob abrasive. Whenever investigations crossed paths with the money laundering trails of Joey, Jacob's pursuit grew relentless, obsessive even. He pressed harder than his peers found comfortable, frustrated Marlin with his persistence, and made enemies faster than allies. Marlin, caught between departmental order and Jacob's unyielding drive, felt the strain in every case briefing. To him, Jacob was reckless, undermining protocol, dragging colleagues into storms they weren't prepared to weather. Yet Jacob's sharp intuition couldn't be dismissed. His instincts had teeth, and they bit deep whenever Joey's name surfaced. Jacob's reassignment to field investigations had given him a taste of freedom, and he seized it with both hands. No longer chained to the monotony of desk work, he now stood on blood-stained asphalt, breathed the acrid smoke of accidents, and sifted through the debris of lives torn apart. It was in this capacity that he arrived at the scene of Doug's so-called accident. The cliffs stretched high and merciless above the ocean, the wreckage of Doug's car still smoldering at the base of the rocks. The story was simple on paper. Doug had chosen to drive when he could have called for a car service. An error of judgment, ending in fire and ash. But Jacob didn't believe in simple stories. He crouched near the scorched ground and his eyes landed on something out of place, a small container, metallic, dented, but unmistakably manufactured for precision. Inside it, traces of a liquid that made his stomach tighten with recognition. This wasn't a household substance. It wasn't sold in stores. It belonged to the kind of supply chain that thrived in the shadows, controlled, regulated, and often weaponized. The liquid's residue whispered of poison, and Jacob's mind spun with implications. If this container had been planted here, Doug's crash wasn't an accident. It was a silencing. Marcel, when briefed on the discovery, barely blinked. His words were dismissive, his tone laced with irritation. Doug had been careless, stupid even, and his end was nothing more than bad luck on a bad road. The bluntness of it startled Jacob. For Marcel to brush off evidence so glaring it was either arrogance or complicity. Jacob stored this reaction like ammunition, another notch in the growing case he was building silently against Marcel and, by extension, Joey. The narrative surrounding Doug's disappearance unsettled the public. Official statements declared him missing, presumed dead. Yet the absence of a body left space for speculation, and in that void, rumors flourished. Doug's car had been identified only through fragments, belongings singed but intact enough to link to him. The fire had consumed everything else. Skeptics wondered aloud whether Doug had been consumed with it, or whether he had slipped away into another kind of captivity. Some suggested he was alive but imprisoned, treated in secrecy for wounds so grave that his face would never be the same. The notion of reconstructive surgery, of Doug emerging later with a new identity, circulated like wildfire among those who refused to let his story end. Jacob found himself caught between professional duty and personal curiosity. He combed through reports, cross-referenced supply chains for the toxin he had found, and revisited every frame of footage from the night of Doug's crash. His mind ran with scenarios. If Doug had been eliminated, why? What did he know that made him dangerous? If he had survived and was hidden, who stood to gain from silencing him? Each path led back to Joey, the man whose dealings in money laundering had already painted him as a predator. Joey, whose confidence in Marcel's cover rattled Jacob every time he recalled that overheard conversation. But the echoes of Doug's absence extended beyond investigation files. His son, Donnell, refused to let the narrative rest. The official explanation of an unfortunate accident ignited something fierce in him. Doug had raised Donnell to trust in justice, and Donnell couldn't reconcile that upbringing with the dismissive closure offered by authorities. He started pushing back, reaching into corners Jacob himself hadn't yet explored. Donnell's anger grew into action, and his footsteps eventually carried him straight to Joey's door. Their confrontation wasn't quiet. Donnell, bristling with grief and rage, warned Joey that this wasn't over. He threatened legal action, speaking of lawsuits and exposure. His determination made Joey shift uncomfortably for the first time in months, a man unaccustomed to being challenged head-on. The weight of Donnell's words hung heavy, not because Joey feared the legal system, but because it meant Doug's shadow still lingered. The deader the missing wary not staying silent. Vanessa, watching these confrontations unfold, carried a dread she couldn't shake. Her connection to Joey was more than professional, more than accidental. She had crossed a line, shared a bed with the man her conscience told her was responsible for Doug's fate. Now, as Donnell's fury escalated, Vanessa feared exposure not only for Joey, but for herself. If Donnell uncovered the truth, the tension gnawed at her. Every stolen glance toward Joey laced with guilt and panic. The narrative was far from over. Jacob's discoveries hinted at a larger conspiracy. Doug's fate dangled between death and survival, and Donnell's pursuit of truth promised to peel back more layers of deception. In the shadows, the organization that Jacob didn't yet understand watched, maneuvered, and waited. Elon's involvement, still hidden from his son, would eventually shift the course of every unfolding event. And as Vanessa struggled with the secret she carried, the web tightened, pulling every character deeper into a game they no longer controlled. The early days of the investigation were like kindling, small sparks threatening to ignite into an inferno. Jacob's suspicions weren't wild theories, they were seeds of something inevitable, truths waiting to be uncovered. Yet for every clue he collected, for every anomaly he noticed, the resistance around him grew. Marcel's dismissiveness, Marlon's frustration, Joey's arrogance, they formed a wall meant to contain him. But Jacob wasn't built for containment. He was built for pursuit, and with Doug's story far from resolved, his chase was only beginning. The unresolved disappearance of Doug cast a shadow that refused to fade, and each of the people closest to the truth began to show the cracks in their facades. Jacob, always stubborn and unrelenting, intensified his focus on Marcel. What had once been a hunch grew into obsession, as though every case file and every late-night lead pointed back to him. Marcel's manner didn't help matters. Calm was too calculated, his indifference to Doug's crash too rehearsed. Every dismissive comment, every attempt to steer Jacob away from the evidence only deepened the conviction that Marcel was shielding someone, perhaps himself, or perhaps the tangled network that bound Joey's operation. Joey, meanwhile, was learning that the arrogance which once served him well was turning into a liability. Donnell's relentless push for answers shook him in ways that investigations never did. Lawsuits could be bought off, but grief-fueled determination couldn't be tamed so easily. Donnell wasn't just threatening legal repercussions, he was threatening exposure. And Joey knew exposure was poison to men like him. For years, he had thrived in the shadows, his laundering schemes hidden behind layers of false fronts and pliable allies. Now, the fire of Doug's mysterious end threatened to burn through that carefully constructed veil. Vanessa, torn between loyalty and survival, felt herself suffocating under the weight of secrets. She had thought her connection to Joey was something she could control, something that wouldn't spill into the lives of others. But Doug's fate made her complicit by silence, and Donnell's grief made her vulnerable to discovery. Each time Donnell confronted Joey, she felt the threat edging closer to herself. Every glance he threw her way seemed tinged with suspicion, though perhaps that was only her guilty conscience reflecting back at her. Yet the more Donnell pressed, the more she feared that Joey might turn on her to save himself, exposing their affair to undercut her credibility if she ever dared to speak against him. The ripple effects of Doug's absence also reshaped the dynamics between Jacob and Marlon. Marlon, exhausted by Jacob's constant probing, began to question whether his colleague was chasing justice or simply chasing ghosts. To Marlon, the poison bottle, the missing body, the rumors of survival, these were puzzle pieces that didn't guarantee a picture. He wanted closure, not endless speculation. Jacob's relentless pursuit grated on him, pulling him into conflict at every turn. But beneath his frustration was something else, a creeping fear that Jacob might actually be right. And if Jacob was right, it meant they were standing in the middle of something much larger than either of them could control. The possibility of Doug's survival became more than whispered theory. Small hints surfaced, subtle but tantalizing. Unconfirmed reports of medical equipment ordered under aliases in nearby towns, witnesses who swore they saw a man with burn scars escorted discreetly through a private clinic. These fragments couldn't be officially verified, but for Jacob, they were enough to fuel the hunt. If Doug had lived, if he had been hidden away and surgically remade, then the implications were seismic. His reappearance would not only undermine Joey but also vindicate Donnell's defiance and shatter Vanessa's fragile pretense. The fear wasn't only that Doug might return, it was that Doug might return with proof. Doug had been meticulous in his own dealings, and Joey couldn't be sure whether he had left behind records, testimonies, or alliances that might surface in his absence. The thought gnawed at him, driving him to tighten his grip on Marcel. Marcel had always been his buffer, the one who managed interference from inside the system. But Jacob's persistence threatened to pierce that shield, and Joey could sense Marcel's composure slipping under the strain. Donnell's role in this growing storm transformed him from grieving son to crusader. He spoke openly about his suspicions, rallied allies, and hinted at evidence he claimed to be gathering. Whether he had concrete proof or was bluffing mattered little. The effect was the same. His determination spread doubt through Joey's circles, making once loyal associates question whether they wanted to remain attached to a man under such scrutiny. Donnell's fury gave him power, and Joey, accustomed to holding all the leverage, found himself cornered by someone who had nothing left to lose. Vanessa's fear of exposure pushed her into dangerous territory. She began to consider options she had once dismissed as unthinkable. Could she distance herself from Joey without drawing suspicion? Could she align herself quietly with Donnell, presenting herself as another victim of Joey's manipulation? The dilemma was crushing. Every decision seemed like a trap. If she stayed close to Joey, she risked being taken down with him. If she betrayed him, she risked retaliation from a man who had already proven he could make people vanish. Her sleepless nights were filled with imagined confrontations, each one ending in ruin no matter which path she chose. Jacob, unaware of his father Elon's shadowed role in all of this, pressed harder on every lead. The poison container remained his anchor, a tangible piece of evidence in a sea of uncertainty. He traced its origins, uncovering a supply chain that didn't just whisper of criminal activity but screamed of organization-level involvement. This wasn't Joey operating alone. This was systemic, coordinated, and protected. Jacob sensed it but couldn't name it, couldn't see the figure moving behind the curtain. That ignorance kept him charging forward, unaware that his pursuit might collide with truths about his own bloodline. The convergence of these forced the paranoia of Joey, the guilt of Vanessa, the determination of Donnell, the frustration of Marlon, and the obsession of Jacob set the stage for inevitable combustion. Each thread tightened, wrapping around the others, until none of them could move without pulling someone else down with them. Joey's empire of shadows was beginning to collapse, not with a sudden implosion, but with the slow, grinding erosion of pressure from all sides. What came next would depend on Doug. If he remained a ghost, Joey might yet weather the storm. But if Doug returned, scarred, unrecognizable, yet armed with truth, the entire balance would shift. The question was no longer whether Doug's story was finished, it was whether his unfinished tale would be the weapon that destroyed the man who tried to silence him. And in the spaces between, Marcel's true loyalties remained a question mark. Was he protecting Joey, protecting himself, or protecting the deeper secret organization that even Jacob hadn't glimpsed? His dismissive words about Doug, his irritation at Jacob's persistence, his role as the gatekeeper between law and crime, all of it pointed to a man standing at a crossroads. One path aligned him with Joey's crumbling empire, the other with forces even more powerful, forces that included Elon. Marcel's choice would decide whether Jacob uncovered the truth or found himself buried beneath it. The pieces were moving, the game accelerating. For Jacob, Donnell, Vanessa, Marcel, and Joey, the coming days promised revelation, confrontation, and the kind of consequences that couldn't be contained by secrecy any longer. The truth about Doug, whether dead, imprisoned, or reborn, would ignite everything they thought they controlled. And when it did, none of them would emerge unscathed. The unraveling came faster than any of them expected. Joey, once untouchable, felt the world collapsing around him in whispers and shadows. Donnell's threats of legal action were no longer just words. Lawyers had begun probing, leaks reached journalists, and the first stories questioning Doug's disappearance started to circulate in hushed tones across the media. Joey doubled down, tightening security, pulling strings through Marcel, but each move seemed desperate, reactive. The predator had become prey, and the scent of fear clung to him. Vanessa saw it more clearly than anyone. She had lived long enough in Joey's orbit to know when his confidence was real and when it was only a mask. This was different. He was cornered, paranoid, his charm breaking into sudden anger, his patience razor-thin. She understood that when men like Joey sensed the walls closing in, they lashed out, and the danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and it would fall hardest on those closest to him. That included her. For weeks she toyed with silence, but as Donnell pressed harder, she realized that her only hope of survival was to pivot before Joey dragged her under with him. Marlon, watching Jacob dig deeper, found himself split down the middle. At first he had seen Jacob's obsession as reckless, but as evidence mounted, the uncomfortable truth settled in. Jacob was right. Marcel's dismissals, Joey's tightening panic, Vanessa's restless anxiety, Donnell's fear weren't random threads. They were connected, each pointing back to the same core. For Marlon, the choice became one of loyalty or truth. Did he stand by the system that kept them all in line, or did he support Jacob in breaking through it, risking his own career and safety? The answer came when Jacob showed him a new lead, a medical purchase order hidden behind false names, connected to a clinic that didn't officially exist. That was the proof Jacob needed. Doug wasn't dead. He had been pulled from the fire, broken, barely alive, and hidden away. The scars had changed him, but he was breathing. And somewhere in his recovery, in the pain and reconstruction, he carried knowledge that could dismantle Joey entirely. Jacob's discovery lit a fuse that couldn't be stopped. The climax unfolded not in a courtroom, not in a police station, but in a quiet, private meeting that none of them would ever forget. Donnell was the first to see him, his father, alive, face scarred, voice hoarse but steady. The reunion was raw, filled with a weight of years stolen and truths withheld. Doug's return wasn't the triumphant miracle some imagined, it was painful, haunting, but undeniable. For Donnell, it was enough. The proof of survival meant Joey's story of accident and carelessness was finished. Jacob and Marlon stood back, watching the reunion, their minds already spinning with the implications. This wasn't just personal closure, it was the cornerstone of a case that could finally rip Joey's world apart. Yet Jacob's focus drifted to Marcel, who lingered near the edge of the room, his face unreadable. For a moment Jacob thought Marcel might lash out, might try to silence Doug once more, but instead, Marcel's gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, to Jacob himself. It was a look that carried more than dismissal, it carried recognition. It was the look of someone who knew Jacob's bloodline, who knew about Elon, the father Jacob hadn't yet connected to all of this. The revelation came quietly, almost cruelly. Doug, weak but determined, spoke of the people who had ensured his silence. Joey, yes, but not Joey alone. There was an organization behind him, one that extended into the very institutions Jacob trusted. And one of its influential figures, one of the shadows guiding the moves, was Elon, Jacob's father. The room seemed to tilt as the words sank in. Jacob had chased Marcel, Joey, Doug's ghost, but the truth was closer, more personal, and more devastating than anything he imagined. For Vanessa, the return of Doug was a death sentence to the fragile eyes she had lived under. She knew Donnell's eyes would eventually turn to her, piecing together her betrayal. She tried to rationalize, to prepare excuses, but in the presence of Doug, scarred yet alive, there was no defense left. Her silence had protected Joey, her affair had tied her fate to his, and now both chains pulled her down. Donnell's expression when he looked at her told her everything. Here would be no forgiveness. Joey, faced with the undeniable truth of Doug's survival, unraveled completely. His empire of shadows collapsed in hours. Associates abandoned him, legal authorities finally moved against him, and his once loyal allies either vanished or turned. The man who had orchestrated so much behind closed doors now stood exposed, stripped of the illusions that made him powerful. Doug's return, Jacob's investigation, Donnell's relentless push, they all converged to crush him. But the story didn't end with Joey's fall. It ended with Jacob, holding the knowledge that his father was part of the very machine he had been fighting against. The irony was sharp, bitter, and inescapable. Every instinct, every battle, every sleepless night had been leading him to a confrontation not just with criminals, but with his own blood. Marcel's silence on the matter spoke volumes. She had always known, always been one step ahead, letting Jacob burn himself on the edges of the truth until the inevitable day it consumed him. The ending left none of them untouched. Donnell reclaimed his father but lost any illusion of innocence in the process. Vanessa lost everything: her lover, her safety, her credibility. Marlon was forced to acknowledge the corruption woven into the fabric of the system he had once trusted. Doug lived, but as a changed man, scarred not just in body but in spirit. And Jacob stood on the threshold of the most devastating discovery of all, that the man he was truly hunting had been standing at his family's table all along. What followed would not be simple justice, nor easy redemption. It would be war, personal, intimate, and inevitable. And as the gates closed on one chapter, they opened on another, darker one, where the real enemy was no longer Joey, no longer Marcel, but the blood that tied Jacob to Elon.